Hello and welcome to this episode of Life with Lizzie Lee. Edge is a comprehensive database of Chinese companies for investors and due diligence researchers. I'm your host, Lizzie, an MIT-trained economist turned journalist here at Wall Street TV who covers China and its relation to the world. Joining me today is former senior CIA China analyst Chris Johnson, now president and CEO of the China Strategist Group. Thank you so much, Chris, for being here with me.
My pleasure.
So, Chris, in your recent analysis, 2022, Xi Jinping's Annus Horribilis, or is it? You argue that given how much Xi Jinping has disrupted China's long-standing political norms, factional models are rendered obsolete. So what is the correct approach to understanding CCP elite politics during Xi Jinping's era?
That's a very good question, and one that's fairly difficult to answer. One thing, we know what isn't working anymore, but how it does work is obviously still a bit of a mystery. So, for example, we've just seen the senior leadership reappear today after what looks like 2 weeks away at their Beidaihe summer retreat. As you know, there are real debates within the China watching community as to whether Beidaihe even happens anymore in a formal sense. And in other words, our actual policy discussions still held up there or not, and so on. And if they are, what does it mean in a situation where those previous factional groupings that used to exist, whether it was Deng Xiaoping versus his more conservative rivals in the 1980s, or Hu Jintao, the former president of China, versus Jiang Zemin, another former president of China, in a later period, we had kind of a sense of how that worked. Xi Jinping has become so politically dominant now, it's very difficult to understand what those dynamics are. And the little glimpses that we do get through official media coverage or things, just positive observable facts, suggests that Politburo Standing Committee meetings or meetings like Beidaihe or these sort of situations are pretty formulaic these days. Xi Jinping makes his utterances, everyone takes dutiful notes, and on we go. Now, obviously, it's a large and complex enterprise, the Chinese Communist Party, with what I prefer to call, instead of factions these days, rival interest groups or constituencies, all of whom have different ideas about policy and so on, and who do have the ability through their formal positioning or their networks of individuals to be able to make those points clear to Xi Jinping and occasionally persuade him of policy choices.
Right, and China watchers seem to agree that the 20th Party Congress is still going to happen. In the article, you argue very convincingly that Xi Jinping has three main goals, all of which is likely to achieve for the Party Congress: A, staying in power personally; B, implementing key personnel changes; and C, theoretical advancement of ideology. So, what are the implications for policies after the 20th Party Congress?
Sure. Well, I think let's take each of those goals in turn. If he is successful, and there's every single sign that he will be in being reappointed or reselected, probably is a better term, for a third term and possibly more. We don't know what his intentions are after that. The one thing I think we can be certain of is Xi Jinping is staying around. He has given us a pretty good picture of what his policy predilections are over the last 10 years. And so we should expect to see more of that. And I think this is important. And one of the reasons why I wrote the paper for the Asia Society was there seems to be a lot of wishful thinking in sort of foreign observer communities, in media, and even in some foreign government communities, that maybe there's an alternative out there to Xi Jinping. And that could mean that we could see some different policies. Obviously, he's had some controversial policy choices, such as his support to Russia and his bromance with Vladimir Putin in the Russia-Ukraine war, and the COVID-0 policy in China domestically. And so that has caused people to wonder, are there alternative voices out there? The answer is no, that unlike those previous periods where you did have contending voices that sometimes occasionally showed up in even the monolithic state media, now there's largely one voice guiding those very consequential decisions. In terms of the second objective, which is to secure positions for his lieutenants and his acolytes, that's very important as well in terms of his ability to drive that policy agenda. So some of the policies that he has introduced, such as the New Development Concept or Common Prosperity or the so-called dual circulation economic model, these are all things that have kind of materialized over the last several years, but which don't really have a real form at this point. They're still sort of theoretical. If he's successful in getting his lieutenants into key positions, whether that be the premier that controls the economic policy, the day-to-day oversight of economic policy, or one of the executive vice premier positions or something like that, that obviously enhances his ability to start to put some more flesh on the bones of those policies. And then lastly, in terms of the ideological aggrandizement issue, the main benefit of that for Xi Jinping. If he is able to truncate his current very clunky 12-word ideological formulation down to just simply Xi Jinping thought, that will then put him on a par with Mao. And as we've learned during Xi Jinping's tenure, it turns out that ideology still matters in a Leninist structure like China's and the Chinese Communist Party. And what it does for him is it makes a situation wherein if a rival group or interest group wants to question either him personally or one of his policies, with Xi Jinping thought in the party constitution, they're not just questioning him or those specific policies, but they're questioning what's called the party's line. And that's a very dangerous enterprise. You can do it, but if you're going to, you better be successful because the consequences will be severe if not.
Right. And, as you mentioned, there's no real evidence of Xi Jinping's power being threatened in any meaningful way. But some of Xi Jinping's policies are indeed very controversial, especially when it comes to economic management and diplomacy. Yes. You mentioned common prosperity, due circulation, this wolf warrior diplomacy, the partnership with Russia, et cetera, et cetera. Do you expect any change in policy direction in those areas that have been controversial?
That's pretty unlikely, although there must be a change in COVID-0 eventually, right? The country obviously has been facing very severe economic challenges in particular, plus the sort of mounting social concerns, social pressures. People are tired of being under constant lockdown and so on. The question has always been, what is the balance on, say, COVID-0 between the political side of it, in other words, waiting for Xi Jinping to get reminted for this third term, and also because the zero COVID policy has been so closely personally associated with him, that has meant that there really hasn't been much room for change, versus what we might call the medical or epidemiological reasons for maintaining the policy. And the reality is it's always been a balance between the two. Sometimes the politics may take precedence and sometimes the science or medicine may take precedence, but they will have to kind of converge before that policy could be changed. With regard to support for Russia, barring something truly egregious by President Putin in terms of his actions in the Russia-Ukraine war, and that would probably be the use of either a tactical nuclear weapon or chemical weapons or a proper nuclear weapon, which would give China no choice. I don't expect there to be a lot of change on that policy either, largely because it fits very neatly with Xi Jinping and the Politburo's assessment of the geopolitical and geostrategic landscape. Their view, which has hardened in the last few years, is that the United States is now China's implacable enemy, out to undermine its sort of rise and its position on the global stage. That makes Russia a natural partner to China in that enterprise, and Europe a sort of vital swing state or swing actor, if you will, in this geostrategic competition that China has with the US. So as long as Xi Jinping and his colleagues with their dialectical materialist mindset continue to judge that that is the nature of the geopolitical landscape, the relationship with Russia is unlikely to change.
Right, and speaking of recent event, what do you think is Xi Jinping's Taiwan calculus? We hear all this saber rattling from Beijing, but is there actually a timeline for reunification?
In my sense, there isn't a timeline because that would be foolish. If there were a timeline, then you're alerting your adversaries, okay, this is the day we're going in or the year we're going in. Of course, there's been a lot of talk, mainly from U.S. interlocutors, about various potential timelines. A more recent one that has appeared in the New York Times and some other publications is the idea that the Chinese could mount some kind of a military strike or perhaps even a full-scale invasion as early as 18 months from now. And other timelines have been suggested of sort of 2027. I think in both those cases, there's reason to doubt that either of them are accurate. In terms of 18 months, what that looks like to me is what we used to call in the government calendar int or calendar intelligence. People are looking at things coming along on the calendar, which would include a Taiwan presidential election in 2024, and suggesting that perhaps that might be a space for them to take military action. Likewise, 2027, of course, will be the end of Xi Jinping's new term, the third term, and there's a lot of view out there that he needs to accomplish reunification with Taiwan during his time as some sort of legacy. 2027, of course, will be the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army. So I suppose the idea is, as a birthday gift to itself, the PLA would go to liberate Taiwan. As you can tell from my tongue-in-cheek response, I just don't think that any of these really have any basis in fact. And in fact, yes, Taiwan, of course, is an existential thing for the Chinese Communist Party. They cannot lose Taiwan and stay in power. But while it is existential, it's also existential in sort of what we might call an ethereal sense. In other words, as long as China's hand is not forced, they're not keen to invade. It remains a crisis to be avoided rather than an opportunity to be seized. Whereas they do have another existential sort of benchmark that they're working against, which is this desire and need, really, to break through the middle income trap by 2035. It's hard for me to see how that is facilitated by a military assault on Taiwan.
Right, and at this point, we seem to agree that Xi Jinping is intent on staying in power, which raises the question about succession. What do we think is going to happen after Xi? Who is likely to be the next leader of China, if there's any sign pointing in that direction?
Well, the short answer is we don't know, and it's hard even to understand candidates, right, at this point. And this is very challenging because, of course, in past successions or even in past run-ups to party congresses, ambitious individuals might begin certain programs or appear in the media a lot. The most obvious case, of course, was Bo Xilai, the full and Politburo member who was serving as the party secretary in Chongqing, where he had established a certain look for himself of a sort of neo-Maoist profile with red songs and all of this stuff, much of which, interestingly, has been adopted by Xi Jinping, even though Bo Xilai was purged and she was critical in that purge. We don't really see that anymore. So we don't see, for example, these days, Chen Minar was now successor by a couple times removed in Chongqing, or other possible candidates who might be in line to succeed Xi Jinping at some point, engaging in those kind of actions. And that's because what we might call the Xi Jinping megaphone, right, is so loud that it is sort of all-encompassing. One thing that's interesting to think about in terms of some of the things that have been discussed for the Party Congress, however, is the notion that perhaps Xi Jinping is considering bringing back the Mao-era party chairmanship. This, of course, would beg the question of, well, if you're going to bring back the chairmanship, should there be vice chairman like there were in the Mao period? It was not a very comfortable position to be in during the Mao period. But of course, that if Xi Jinping did want to show, because his third term is controversial, look, I'm starting a process toward a succession scenario by naming someone to a party vice chairmanship. That could be a way for us to get a sense of that. Likewise, there's been some suggestion in the early rumors coming out of the Beidaihe meeting that the Politburo Standing Committee, the top decision-making body in the Chinese Communist Party, may once again be expanded from its current 7-member size to 9. If that happens, it would be hard for me to see how that scenario doesn't create an opportunity to showcase a successor. And that's probably precisely exactly why it won't happen, because Xi Jinping probably is not ready for that at this time.
If you enjoy our discussions here, I'm sure you would find value in our new powerful marketplace tool for investors, also called China Edge. It tracks, distills, and analyzes both Chinese language and English language materials about Chinese companies, business leaders, and government entities, and reviews the often hidden links between them. For our YouTube viewers, we are offering a limited time 50% discount. Just go to the link you see on the screen and use the code EDGE50. Also, sign up for the China Edge newsletter. It's a daily 2-minute rundown of China business news you don't want to miss. The link is right here on the screen. You can also click on the link in the video's description section to get your complimentary subscription today.